Okay.
Okay. So I wanted to hear from you what you think flash fiction is. Does anybody want to jump in and tell me what they think it is? Or what it isn't? Either one. Tom? You're muted.
I had to unmute. Sorry. Yeah, I think flash fiction is a very short, form of fiction that follows the same story arc as we normally see in fiction, but it's extremely limited in terms of number of words. Perhaps conventionally 300 words. Is that it? But of course, that could be changed. But that's all. So it simply requires considerable economy of word usage.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, flash often is traditionally 1,000 and under, and then 300 and under might be called micro. Although
Okay.
we're microlit almanac and we take 1,000 and under, so it is semantics. And Sarah said in the chat, which I lost already, a similar thing because it has an entire narrative arc, which is definitely right. Anybody else have thoughts? Well, this is a really good definition, and we're going to expand on this and also talk about what makes it not necessarily prose poetry and the sort of blend between the two. But first, I'm going to read this piece by Cheryl Pappas, and then I'm going to ask you to write. So I'll begin with Red Mother Pepper by Cheryl Pappas. Your bony shoulders, Red Pepper, tell me you're ready to go wherever we take you, in our basket, in our fridge drawer, on the counter, ready to be sliced wide open. I can almost see you putting on a coat, heading out the door, always offering your useful body, always holding in something especially dear, a certain sweetness that comes out only when you've been torn apart underneath all your practical, responsible gestures. I think, Red Pepper, the best way to show you love is to let you roast so you can let go at last of all that skin, all those ripened seeds, so that you can be nothing but your sweet and succulent center, to lose everything you don't need. And I love this piece written by, it's got an autobiographical quality because this was written not that long after her mother passed away. So we can think about all the metaphorical connections that are happening there. And if you ever want to read it again, just go find the first submission, the first publication of the Microlit Almanac that you'll find in Birchbark Editing. And so hopefully the inspiration that comes from that huge controlling metaphor and that theme of the sacrificial nature of love will inspire you as I get ready to ask you to write. I'm going to pressure you with only 5 minutes to write. And I have a prompt for you. I'd like you to begin with, I used to be able to. So if you want to go ahead and begin writing, I will time you.
Would you repeat that, please?
I will, and I'll put it in the chat too. I used to be able to. Go ahead and begin. just a minute left. All right, your time is up. If you can go ahead and wrap things up, please. And though it feels unnatural to me in what I usually do in these courses that we run, we read them, and I'd love to hear what you got. We might be able to do some of that at the end. But for now, we're going to go ahead and move forward and talk about flash fiction as a form, with at least holding on to the fact that you wrote a little bit just now, which is fantastic. And we're going to talk about this technique as well. So we already said, and you very wonderfully defined, that flash fiction is a shorter writing form that still has a narrative arc. So why isn't it prose poetry? Does anybody have any ideas? And Tom, I can see that look on your face.
I wish you would define what is prose poetry.
Very nice. Well, you know, as Tom would disagree, there are some there's some looseness or some blending between boundaries. I mean, the boundaries between genres. And what I'd like to say is that typically you'll find that poetry is driven by images, it's driven by vignettes, and while it could have a narrative arc, it doesn't have to have one. Does that help?
Yes.
Great. And then when we think of the opposite of that, or at least think of the way that we're juxtaposing right now, flash fiction versus prose poetry, flash fiction is driven by narrative urgency. It's not just a narrative arc. It's a narrative arc that has to be told. It has to be told in this form right now. There's no other way to do it. And we got to get the story out before it's too late. And that feeling of it has to happen is something different than maybe, I don't want to say the word languishing because that has connotations that I don't mean, but you know, being allowed to sort of spend our time with the imagery or vignettes that can happen in poetry. In flash fiction, we're going to read through it because that action's pushing us, but then we'll probably go back and read through it again, right? Because so much is happening. So we just talked about the difference between flash fiction and prose poetry. William?
You can hear me?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing what's.
Oh, we can hear you. We can hear you, Bill, fine.
Okay, good. That's what I was saying. But what I wanted to say was that and I think you just said it well about the urgency of the story. The way you have to think of flash fiction, the way I've always thought of it, is that it's really a compression of something else that could be longer, but just isn't. And so it's that compression sense. All the elements of a narrative arc have to be there, but it's just very compressed. And so the question is, what do you compress? Well, you can't compress the story. The story has to be the story. So you have to think of a complete story that happens in that compressed period of time. So that's the way I always try to think of it, and it helps me get started anyway.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's something that I plan to talk about. Thank you, Bill. Yeah, so compressing a story. And the question that you can ask yourself is, do I take a large story and compress it, or do I write with the intention of being short to start with? And I would say yes. Both of those things can be true.
That's
And
right.
so the technique that we just used to write under a compressed time frame can help us to take any type of story, create an entire narrative arc, and that urgency and the timing that we're writing can help create some of the urgency in your story. But of course, doesn't mean it's finished, right? Because you have to go back and edit it. But also a technique that I know all the long form writers here will agree with is taking an existing large story and cutting it by 50%. Say you have a 3,000 word story and cut it down to 1,500 words, you'll find out what's the most essential work that's on the page for you there.
What to
But then
go.
I challenge you to cut it down to 750. And then I challenge you, and I had to do the math before we got together, to cut it down to 375. And now you almost have a piece of microfiction, and you've taken a 3,000 word story and cut it down to almost just about 10% of what it was. And that might be a micro story for you. You just have to find out if you can make the story you were working on into something that small. And what I would argue, and certainly I think I spoke to Tracy about this before, but one of the things I've been doing with my memoir is taking each chapter and writing a micro version, micro nonfiction narrative of each chapter to try to understand what each one is about. And that is a really illuminating experience that I recommend for everybody who's writing in long form. Okay, so one of the most important points that I want to make about the difference, though, still in flash fiction, just as Bill was saying, we have to have that compression, but flash fiction uniquely will have an ending that is going to be some kind of shift or surprise. And this will get me briefly into the writing of flash fiction. Your very own Katie Schultz from the NC Writers Network. I'd heard of the 5 S's before, and I didn't realize she'd published on them, but she has. Oh, and I have the link in the chat if you want to, take a look at these 5 S's later. But she says, and I agree, that flash fiction has setting, situation, sensory detail, simile, and she calls the end one that she says, and shift. In my language, I call that the oof. Like, wow, something amazing just happened at the end of this. And sometimes it's a gut punch. Sometimes you just step back and go, whoa, but you should be surprised, shifted, changed by the ending of a flash piece in the ways that you often should be also in other narrative writing, but it's a requirement in flash fiction for your flash to be successful. So I recommend you take a look at Katie's site to look more into these 5 S's. She describes them wonderfully there. And another important thing that has to happen, and this is something that happens in poetry as well, but flash fiction depends on reader interaction. So some people think that flash fiction is my hand up? Oh, there we go. Some people think that flash fiction is for people with a short attention span or less hard work or maybe easier to write. And all of these things aren't true, particularly because you're counting on the reader to pick up on your implication, to pick up on inference, to pick up on the white spaces that you're leaving and that they are supposed to understand or fill in with their own experiences or their own understanding of language. And so it's really, it's kind of like going to a museum for miniatures and appreciating the work that somebody does in tiny detail. Flash fiction requires readers to pick up on all of those tiny details, and you are counting on them doing that when you're writing it. Do you think I've missed anything on what flash fiction is? Does anybody want to say anything else about what it is?
I got a question. I just wrote my 300-word piece in poetry. I thought fiction, and I looked it up on the internet and all that kind of stuff. I thought fiction meant something that was, it kept saying it was not factual, it was not true. And when it said any form of fiction, any genre of fiction, I thought that meant then it could be poetry. Is that wrong? In which case I've got 297 words of poetry.
Well, this is where Tom's leaning forward. This is where there's some questions about genre. I mean, flash fiction will tend to have a narrative arc in it, but one of the forms of flash fiction is fragmented. And so, is there an implied narrative arc in what you've written? Could it be read as fragmented narrative? Maybe it would fit in. But if you're being, as I said, that poetry can be, if it's being driven by images, by vignettes, but doesn't create that narrative arc, then you might not have quite landed it. Carol, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that it seems to me the principal interest between poetry and fiction is that fiction may not deal with what is factually true, but it deals in language that is understood as it's written. But poetry is meant to speak to the brain and the heart and the senses and everything in ways in which the words may not be exactly, don't have exactly the literal meaning, or put together in combinations that have the same sense of reality that something that is written in the same language that a piece of fiction is. That's the difference that I would draw between the two.
And of course, I would hop in and say that all that lovely language you just used about heart and additional meaning, I mean, that's necessary in fiction too. So it's hard to.
Of course.
Yeah. But it does tend to be written in sensical sentences, if
Yeah.
that's kind of what you're driving at. Yeah. Deriving meaning in ways that we typically understand to happen in sentences built into paragraphs, built into narrative. Yeah. Great. So should we move into writing flash and what that involves? Great. Okay, so I think that you'll have noticed what in the writing that I sent to you, and also in what I read to you from Red Pepper Mother, that flash fiction and nonfiction, so prose, tends to jump straight in. It tends to do that in medias res thing, where we jump into the middle of events that are already happening, because we don't have time. And honestly, in all good writing, we don't have this time, but for sure in flash fiction, we don't have time to clear our throats. We don't have our time to luxuriously set out the setting and the context and the cultural context and build a character. And that's one of the things, novels allow writers to do a lot of the work for readers, so that they are maybe thinking at a different level to engage in the work. But I would argue that one of the most important points of flash fiction is that every sentence you write has to be accomplishing at least two different things, at least two different fictional element things. So you may be introducing a physical setting and giving us cultural context while introducing a character in one sentence, right? And that everything needs to have multiple meanings. I call it doing double duty. And then when I take notes, when I'm reading other flash fiction, I might put DD, where a sentence is doing great double duty, but it might be doing triple duty even, right? And it's that figurative language, the language that has multiple meanings, that help make flash fiction just come alive for all of us. So we have to jump right in and have our words doing as much work as possible. I'm trying to think of an example where, people just start digging as fast as they can. And I remember being stationed in a foreign country, and a team of people were brought in to dig a ditch, and a job that I would have thought, I can't measure feet, but say it was 50 feet long, and I would have thought it would have taken all day, and they accomplished it in 2 hours, because I just never seen such a fury of work happening with all these different shovels. And that's almost the feeling you should have as you are. This is going to come probably when you're editing. As you're editing the work you have on the page, you should have that just energy and excitement and again, fury of work happening in your words while you're writing. You don't have the opportunity to have any redundancy. Your pace has to be quick and to the purpose. We've talked about it being intentionally short. We've done the time constraint. Wow, we've done a lot of this already when we were talking. So when we think about a typical story arc would have an inciting incident, rising action, a climax that happens, and that maybe you might have the declining action and then a denouement or some kind of ending. Those types of things will exist in your flash fiction, but they happen so much faster that maybe your inciting incident and rising action are one sentence in another sentence, right? Especially in your microfiction. Those things might happen within the same sentence as you're heading towards a climax. But keep in mind that the Freytag's pyramid of how things move in a fiction story apply to flash fiction as well. And one of the things that, so I should have pointed out, one of my favorite books on this topic is called Going Short. I don't know if you can see that. It's Nancy Stolman's invitation to flash fiction. And while I felt like a lot of what she was saying in there, just the same as Katie's 5 S's, there are things I feel like I've heard all along, but she writes everything in flash form. So each of her paragraphs on each of her chapters on a topic is very accessible. So you can read it as you're going along. And I recommend the book. She says we'll feel like flash frauds when we start writing. And I agree with her. Just like if you're learning how to write poetry, or you're learning to be a short story writer, or you're learning to be an essay writer, flash fiction or nonfiction is its own genre and its own form. And just when we think we know how to write well, moving into something like this is a schooling for me, trying to find homes for work that I think is great. And I find that I'm still learning how to write the form well. Another book that I appreciate is The Best of Brevity. Dinty W. Moore and Zoe Bossier. That book has a lot of wonderful flash fiction, some of which you can also find online at their website. And then they support several craft books by the Rose Metal Press. And they have a book on flash nonfiction, flash fiction, and prose poetry, and one more that I just forgot the title of. So those are resources that I recommend when you're looking at how to write flash fiction, if you want something you can hold in your hand and refer to after this talk. And then where do you get so we talked about you need to have the complete arc. We talked about the 5 S's that Katie Schultz has offered on your NC Writers Network blog. We've talked about compression. We've talked about urgency, getting right in medias res, and giving us that oof or gut punch at the end. So how do you go about writing? I highly recommend using the time compression all the time. And then Nancy Stolman says, keep a dream journal and write from that, because your mind is so let loose in a dream. It doesn't have the filters we keep imposing on it. I can't remember what I dreamed. So for me, that's hard to work on. She says to write down that you don't remember what you dreamed, and pretty soon you'll start to remember. So I should try that. I also think that finding writing prompts is a great way to get yourself writing, and then use that time compression. And that time compression helps remove that filter for you, just because your brain says, oh, I have to get to work. And all the games it likes to play with you, or at least my brain likes to play with me, get pushed aside as you use that time compression to write. And the last part of writing flash fiction that I want to talk about before we're going to talk about reading it and look at one of them is the title for your flash fiction. So if Cheryl Pappas had just said The Red Pepper in her title, how much would it have taken it for us to figure out that this was about her mother? But to write Red Pepper Mother is giving us a clue or an entry into the writing, right? And we're going to look Brenda Miller's The Shape of Emptiness. And I think Carol said that she could put it up on share screen as well so people can look at it. The Shape of Emptiness. Are you able to share the screen and show it? I thought we could take a look at it just to look at through the things we talked about with what's necessary in flash fiction for writing, and then we'll talk about editing once we've taken a look at this sample. And if you can just make me, okay, I was gonna say if I'm a co-host, I could do it. Perfect. Oh, wow, well played. It's all there. And Brenda Miller is the co-editor with Suzanne Paola of, it's hard when I have a background, Tell It Slant. And I love this book. We used to use Tell It Slant as a textbook of all things for our freshman composition at the Air Force Academy, which is when I was first introduced to it. But it's a fantastic book. So this author who wrote The Shape of Emptiness does have this book, Tell It Slant, which I also highly recommend. It's creating, refining, and publishing creative nonfiction. So she even talks about it at the larger scale. And there's some beautiful essays in there. Consider the Knife. I think Brian Doyle's Joyous Valadoris is in there, Joyous Valadoris, which is wonderful. Okay, so if we look at The Shape of Emptiness, even though I ended with titles, what does Brenda Miller offering us The Shape of Emptiness do for us as readers to set us up to read her work?
Well, she gives us a puzzle because the concept of the shape of emptiness is puzzling. It's
Absolutely, right? Now we have a mystery to understand because we don't know what The Shape of Emptiness is, but we suspect she's about to tell us, right? So easily enough, this is nonfiction, so it's not a surprise that she wrote in the first person point of view. What is a surprise a bit to me for both this one and for Paradise Cut is what verb tense it's written in. Can anybody point that out to me?
It's present. And then it moves to.
Right,
future,
it's
and then
right,
goes
it's
back to
written
present.
in. Right, the only past tense is, well, I have this written down, but it's written in the present tense, which I find to be a bit of a surprise because we know in nonfiction she's relating a memory to us. So what effect do you think that this present tense could have on us as readers, and why would we make that kind of an authorial choice as we're writing about a memory?
It makes us like a present observer.
Right, as if we're sitting in the classroom with her, right, Sarah? Yeah, and so this is, I think, in very short nonfiction, it's a really effective tool to bring the reader alongside the experience and make us feel as if we're present, in this case, in the classroom with Brenda Miller and this experience she has. I think when you're looking at longer nonfiction, particularly something, say, of memoir length, but even possibly long essays, you can consider some present tense to get your reader engaged, say the first chapter of a memoir or something, but ultimately it becomes almost tedious for a reader to remain in the present tense with somebody talking about their past. So it's just a decision I wanted to point out and have us thinking about, because it's a fun technique, but as we're reading this for techniques, we want to be sure we don't wear our readers out by saying, you're always here, you're always here, you're always here, be with me, right? So then, who is our character in this piece? In other words, how long does it take us to find out who, like, what the character is that's narrating this? And I don't know, I should ask really quick, did any of you get a chance to read it before we came this
Yes.
morning? Great. I'm asking all these questions and didn't ask whether you read it. So Good, let's move forward then.
We know it's the teacher in the first sentence.
In the first sentence? Why?
Well, because I don't know who else a student would email to ask permission to be absent.
Well, the first sentence is his mother dies 3 weeks before.
Or the
the
second,
end of the
sorry,
order.
second.
Oh, no, but we do know kind of in the first. At least we know that it's related to school, right? I thought you were picking up on the wonderful way that not only were we given the inciting incident and the urgency of somebody's mother dying, which is of course a most grievous event, but we're given the setting that it has to do with the school environment, right? So thanks, Sarah. That's where I thought you were heading with it. But we do find out that she's a teacher. Now, do many of you write nonfiction here? Yeah. So an important thing to think about when you're writing nonfiction is the character in this flash nonfiction is a teacher, but there's another character that's the same person. And what is that?
The student, the boy.
True, there is another character in this piece, and it is. I'm thinking also, though, of that trick that happens in nonfiction when we write in the first person. We write about ourselves, but ourself becomes a character on the page, right? So what other consciousness is present as we read about this teacher?
The narrator
Yeah.
is a separate character.
So something when we're writing nonfiction that we need to be conscious of is treating our character of ourselves as a character and allowing ourselves to have enough narrative distance as the actual narrator author to write our own character well, because sometimes we're just too close to ourselves to write ourselves as a good character. So this is a reminder I wanted to give you in this piece because she does this really well, I think. One of the things I didn't mention, and I meant to in writing, is that of course there is no room in flash fiction for cliche, right? And in fact, I read somewhere that a cliche is any metaphor anybody's ever heard of before. I feel like that's a little bit much, but it's a great idea because if a cliche is, I've done this a million times, your job is to say, what's a new way to say that I've done this a million times? I bring this up because Brenda Miller in nonfiction takes us right into a little bit of kind of dialogue. It's at least an email, right? And the first thing she does on line 3 is hand us a cliche, right? Of course, I say, take as much time as you need, which is what every teacher says when they're faced with absolute tragic circumstances. Why does a cliche work for Brenda Miller in this case?
I think because the situation is so immediate.
Absolutely. We're right there with her. And what else can you say when somebody says their mother has died? I mean, of course, there are other things you can say, but as a teacher, you're in that limbo, sort of intimate space where you know somebody, but the best you can do is say, in this cliche way, I'm supporting you. You can take the time you need, of course. What about the pace? What would you say about Brenda Miller's pace at this point? Does she have the urgency? And how does she create it? Can you see how she's doing that?
I think because she,
Each paragraph,
go ahead.
each paragraph is a movement in time.
Right, that's nice. So at the paragraph level, she's taking us along, right? And within those paragraphs, she's also creating a sense of urgency. And how does she do that?
I think by using short phrases. And each phrase moves the timeline along. You know,
Absolutely. So short sentences, short sentences, short sentences. Very nice. Yeah. And she offers us a beautiful metaphor at the end of the second paragraph, which is a bright thread of tenderness coils around us. And as she moves from that bright thread of tenderness to her walking amongst the students, she has created that thread of tenderness around our reading too. We see that scene with that soft glow of tenderness in it, right? So the first sentence of the third paragraph is, we've been talking about white space. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I was getting ready to talk to you. And when I reread this paragraph, I thought, oh, she's talking about craft a little bit too. She's talking about what is effective in flash writing, maybe not purposefully, but she's already left white space for us. We don't know much about this boy, except for that his mother died, and that now they're in this tenuous situation, and that in their own classroom, they've been talking about absence. And of course, now we have a mother who's absent, right? So she sets us up to find out about the shape of emptiness, even though we don't know it yet. And I admire her so much as a teacher already, because she's taking these great ideas into her classroom, which is wonderful. Okay, so at the end of this paragraph, I want to ask you about, she says, I'll read the paragraph. We've been talking about white space, about the necessity of pause, of absence, the power of the gap, of what is unsaid and unspeakable. I have nothing much more to tell them, these students who are winding their way toward their final projects. So I allow them to work with each other, to mull and brainstorm while I walk among them. And what I think is really profound about this paragraph is she's enacting something. And can you pick up on what she's showing to us by enacting this for us? It's a critical piece of flash fiction writing that she's doing here. Not in her writing, but in the actions of the character. And when you think about absence, and you think about gaps and white space, and you think about flash writing, we have very specific words on the page. And what is the juxtaposition of the words on the page? If we're seeing things, but we're in flash, what are we not doing? And what is the teacher not doing as she walks among the desks?
Talking.
She's not talking. She's not using words. And what's the other word for not using words?
silence.
More to tell them.
Yeah. And so when we're writing flash fiction, and I think this is so brilliant of Brenda Miller, is not only is she talking about the gaps and white space that we leave in our writing, but just by the fact of compression, we are leaving out things we might have said in a different form. We are creating silences, and her silence in this classroom is being balanced with the creativity of her students. So if you were to sort of awkwardly plug in author and flash fiction for the teacher who's been teaching them about white space, and then make the students the readers, they are now actively engaging with the concept. So again, we write these great ideas, but we have white space, we have gaps, and then we have this juxtaposition where we're silent, but we're expecting the readers to figure out the shape of emptiness, right? Okay, let's pop through the rest of this because I'm probably taking too much time, but I just love this piece and I love to just languish in it and spend time in it. So I was surprised on page 2 that she offered us an adverb. The boy sits attentively, but it tells us something. So we know in this form, I think this piece is 678 words. We know in this form that that adverb is purposeful because every word she offers us is purposeful. And as prose writers, certainly as writers, we should sit up and pay attention when somebody who's this intentional puts an adverb in her writing. Let's see what it means. And it's told us something, it characterizes the boy, and in the unexpectedness of an adverb is doing, I think, double duty. Let's take a look now at the paragraph that begins with, when the time comes for presentations. She does a lot of double duty in this, and it's because she's already working in a topic that lends itself, right? In her classroom, she's teaching a topic that lends itself to be characterized or represented in this way. So when the time comes for the presentations, the students rise to the task. One girl unfurls a quilt with sections of her essay printed on each square. She tells us she and her mom and her sisters stitched this together, this story of family over Thanksgiving. One girl has made her own soap and buried scraps of her essay inside the rough-hewn cakes. She brings in bowls of water and towels, asks us to wash our hands with her essay while she reads about shame, about wanting to be cleansed. She begins to cry, and I finish the recital for her. What kind of double duty do you see gloriously happening for her just because of the nature of her teaching assignment?
Would you repeat the question, Max?
What kind of double duty do you see happening here for Brenda Miller? When she has the sisters stitched together this story of family over Thanksgiving, what are multiple things that are happening? What's happening with the verb stitched? And how is it related to story and the quilt?
It's literal, but it's also a metaphor.
Yes. Excellent. And this is, in flash fiction, verbs are just ripe proving ground for things to do double duty, right?
Mm.
Powerful verbs used in the exact right place. When in the next part, when she reads about shame, about wanting to be cleansed, cleansed is working for her in a similar way. So yes, look for those powerful verbs. And then finally we get to the boy who has them squeeze their hands into the Play-Doh and set them forward, and we see what shapes the fists make. And then he asks, what is the shape of emptiness? And please tell me you all got goosebumps when you saw her title show up and it was the meaning, right? I have goosebumps just talking to you about it now. And I think it's something we haven't thought of before. I hadn't thought of before in this way until I saw this. And so she says, he asks us, what is the shape of emptiness? Then he pauses. And of course, what has he mimicked that the teacher did? We have a moment of
Silence.
yep, silence, white space, emptiness. And suddenly, just by being shown, as she says it, he made visible the air we never see. And suddenly the air around us has shape, right? We see the world in a new way. So by this point in this piece, she's already accomplished that narrative arc and change that the reader needs, that the character needs, right? But she goes on. And I think that can be a little bit surprising until you look at the way that she becomes a Facebook friend with the boy, and she writes the second to the last paragraph right at the end. She says, I'll watch his hands as he carries one baby, then another, and see how full they have become. And again, if we talk about double duty, he had lost his mother. He had learned the shape of emptiness. He used hands to show that. And now she understands that more family, growing family, fills his hands and fills the emptiness, even if it can't fully fill it. But that final paragraph. But for now, when he finishes reading, he gathers our hands and gives them back to us one by one. We take them from him carefully so we can carry our emptiness into the day. We compare them, showing off the shapes of our grasping. Like curled like prayers, like anger, like love. In what ways do you think, and I can't think you could argue she doesn't, in which ways does Brenda Miller give us an oof, a gut punch, a shift, a surprise at the end with those 3 short, incomplete sentences?
Well, for me, it actually starts in the sentence before the shapes of our grasping, because that's really a poignant image, especially if we're talking about emptiness.
Yes, yes. The shapes of our grasping, and then she describes them.
And
So-
also her pronoun goes like is we. So
Right.
like when we start, then we go to curled like prayers, like anger, like love. It makes me wonder, like, what is my emptiness filled with?
Excellent, absolutely. That's it. And so that first person narrator suddenly becomes a plural first person narrator. And we're all supposed to gain from that emptiness, right? And so if every really great piece has a theme, a universal message or idea that gets across, sometimes we'll simplify that by saying the theme of this is love or the theme of this is anger. But the theme is never just that one word. It's the one word that's also pushed or characterized by the author's value of that word. So in this one, she tells us the theme is the shape of emptiness, except for that does not complete it. And what does seem to complete it is these final words where she is characterizing exactly what Sarah said, right? That now the author wants to get across to us that we all have an emptiness. We just don't know what it's shaped like until we see the visible shape that the air takes on, right? And when I read flash fiction like this, sometimes I wonder why I'm trying. Because it's so brilliant and so tightly put together. But as you can see from, whatever edition of Tell It Slant I have, Brenda Miller is an expert, right? This is what she does, and she's so good at it. Are there any other thoughts on her piece before we move on to editing flash fiction?
Yeah, it seems to me, excuse me, there's a narrative technique called the presence of the thing not spoken, in which the story, the author carves out a story out of emptiness, if you want to think of it that way, in words, but the real story is only referred to or is only there if you think about it for a minute or if you see it. In other words, the real story occupies the empty space that the story only introduces you to. So the story is introducing you to the empty space. And here, that's exactly what he's doing. His stories, and all the stories, at least his story, the empty space is occupied by the death of his mother, obviously. And death is the most obvious kind of emptiness that there is for us. So I think that's what she's done. She's managed to capture that idea and that concept in a very skillful way.
Oh yeah, I love that you said that. And particularly my heart is warm because I serve on the Willa Cather Foundation and the board member or whatever, board of governors. And Cather is famous for having said that it's the thing not said, right? And if any of you have ever taken that a basic art class, one of the techniques they'll teach you is to say, put a vase in the middle of the room and then draw the whole room without actually drawing the vase. And pretty soon you'll understand what the object is simply by what the space around it shapes it to be. And that's kind of what Bill's talking about, that, if you write enough around something, you will understand it. And that could be right where the story is, but you don't ever have to actually write the thing itself. Very nice. Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I just had a feeling while we were reading it that it keeps trying to break out into other stories too. That there's the story of the girl with her quilt
Mhm.
and what the family did. And there's the story of the girl with the reading about shame, and that makes us wonder what the shame is. And then there's the story of what the boy turns into in adulthood. So I mean, the story keeps trying to break out of its boundaries
Oh, yes, very nice.
for me.
Now, if we could
Yeah.
all write those kinds of stories, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
just go try. Just go try.
Oh, I have been, right? Haven't we all?
Yeah.
Oh, that's such a wonderful thought. Thank you.
Hmm.
So when we talk about editing flash fiction, I think a lot of this will sound familiar to you because these are things we do as writers, period. But I would love to talk about them. I'd love to talk about them again because, you know, it never hurts to be reminded. And so one of my favorite techniques already is to use the save as function in my computer and create a whole new file. And that way, when I maul, rip apart, shred whatever I'm working on, I don't lose what I already had. And if I'm working on something big, I also have what I call like a throwaway file, but it's not, I don't name it that. I name it something very important because it's precious to me, but I can take material that I'm cutting out in chunks and set it somewhere, and then it's not lost forever. So you probably all use that technique. And then when we talk about revision, really we're talking about revisioning things. And that means often having to set aside our work for a while or create techniques to make it seem new to us. Even a few days away from something can help, but if you can set it aside for a week or longer until it becomes almost somebody else's writing, that is a huge help. It is something that you can do. A question to ask yourself, especially in flash fiction, is possibly, have you gone too far? And I brought that up in Brenda Miller's piece because she didn't, but you almost would have thought so. So ask yourself, could the middle be the end? Or ask yourself, could that second paragraph be the first? Or our favorite famous one is your last paragraph, your first paragraph. All of those things are ways, especially with computers, that we can play with revision and editing, and it allows us to see things in a new light just by changing them around. Be sure you abandon those cliches that I talked about. One of the things that's nice in flash fiction, because it's so short, is to think of the piece also in blocks. And one of the ways that we do this as long form writers is we might cut up our paragraphs and, you know, move them around on the floor with pieces of paper. But flash is so short, you might be able to just say, use highlight colors or something to recognize the blocks that are in your flash, and then be able to move them around and try reading your piece. And so my final advice for some of the things that you can do for editing is to use techniques like reading aloud to make it seem new to you. So I know that you've all been told to read your work aloud, and I famously will cover up my mistakes reading aloud still. So I was grateful to find that Microsoft Word has a read function, and it'll read it aloud to you. And wow, all those mistakes I've been covering up because I read aloud first. And then I change the voice to a woman. There's only one woman's voice, two men's voices in Word. And I have her read to me. And I'll catch stuff all the time that my brain said, ah, that's good. So you could have Microsoft Word read aloud to you. You can change the font in the piece. You can print it out, which, you know, takes a lot of ink and trees, but if that's what you need, do it. And my favorite one, and gosh, with that 250 plus page dissertation I had to write back in 2007, I read the whole thing sentence by sentence backwards, not in one sitting. But reading your piece backwards forces your brain to recognize whether those transitions are there, whether the connections are there. And in, at least in Flash, it's not as onerous. You can read backwards from, you know, the first sentence to the last, and it'll only take you a few minutes, but it'll give your brain a chance to unsettle itself from the forward trajectory of your narrative, and you should be able to see things anew. Do you all have any other editing techniques I didn't mention that are helpful to you? I see Les grinning, but he doesn't have one.
I'm just thinking, if I read my work backwards and it made sense to me, it would scare the hell out of me. My best editing technique is to give it to my wife.
So if you don't have a wife to give it to, you already know your whole story though. So if you read it backwards, you know what's coming. And then you can find out whether your brain was wrong in telling you that it put it in that order. So that, you know, if you're surprised by the sentence that comes before it, you can say, wait a minute, did it work? And maybe it did, or maybe it didn't. And then obviously, as you're using these techniques, I've told you ways to look at it, but just ask yourself again, have I created a sense of urgency in my writing? Have I worked with compression? You know, Brenda Miller manages to go from basically a scene in her classroom all the way until the guy is an adult having children, but each moment is highly compressed. And so have you created the urgency, the compression? Look at Katie Schultz's, what are you doing with your setting? Is there a powerful situation? And situation comes across a bit like flat, right? So if you think of Vivian Gornick's craft book, The Situation in the Story, the situation comes across more as plot, but the story is the emotional experience. Have you created something that has insight? Does it have wisdom? Does it have a context? And as you look at those 5 S's, are you using sensory detail, the thing that brings your reader into the story with you? The word simile in her 5 S's, so there's setting, situation, sensory detail. Simile is there because it's an S, but really it's metaphor. How are you engaging in figurative language? And often sensory detail is a great place to bring out that figurative language, to use metaphors, because those can carry extra weight. If you say something is as soft as your childhood teddy bear, the teddy bear has an emotional weight that goes along with the very literal softness that goes with it as well. So try to pick that figurative language, metaphors that mean more than one thing, so that your sentences can be doing the double duty for you. And check and make sure that you have that shift, that surprise, that oof at the end of your writing. And all of those things should be present. And then I recommend doing things like count the length of your sentences. Are they all 7 words? Oh no. That can become a form of repetition even in this short distance. Do all of your sentences begin with the word say I? I have a problem with that in memoir, but do you vary the way your sentences are constructed? Look at the way that Brenda Miller brilliantly handed us those 3 partial sentences at the end to shake up her. She has kind of a lovely longer sentence sense of writing. And then at the end, she surprises us again on multiple levels. Maybe those partial sentences aren't doing double duty, but the fact of them are, because of what they're saying, and that she doesn't write like this throughout the rest of the piece. So take a look at things that are mechanical, like your word length. Are you repeating pronouns, in ways that become onerous to readers? Look at the very mechanical things. And then at the end, you're right there and you think you're done. Think about that theme. What is your story about? And what are you hoping somebody will gain from it? And if your story is about love, never leave it at that one word. Instead, ask yourself, love that, transcends all time, or whatever the emotional value is about that one thing. So if it's about grief in what context? Grief in what emotional meaning for you as an author? And that will get you some great editing going on, and it can keep you busy for a while and get you to resist sending your story out before it's ready, which is the final thing that we thought we'd go into. I thought we'd go into, oh, that's not the final thing. See, I should look at my notes before I say that. But yes, briefly about publication, I do want to say I gave you a very partial, tiny list of places you could publish at the end of that Word document that Carol linked you to, but also a couple of articles that talked about even more places. I did mention Microlit Almanac because we opened for submissions in September, and now you know me, so you should submit to us. We'd love to see your work. And one of the things that Nancy Stolman says that I love is that if you're trying to publish, or if you successfully publish in any of the things you do as an author, she says, and I agree, that she doesn't like the term shameless self-promotion. And it's because it's not. As authors and readers, we should be supporting each other. And if you have the great fortune to be published and have success, don't call it shameless. Just go ahead and let us know, because we'll celebrate along with you. So do all that editing before you send it out, but when you get published, we want to know. So be sure you talk about it in whatever ways that you connect with other people. But the final thing I want to talk about briefly is Reading Flash. And we just did that as a group to talk about the content for writing. But as you know, being authors, all of you, reading like a writer in whatever genre you're working on writing on is the most essential way to see if you're fitting into the genre, to get ideas about the techniques, to admire people like Brenda that make you want to quit. But it's such a great way to see the craft being done and to emulate what people you admire are doing in your own way. And then allowing yourself to see, but I see room for me to be creative in this way. And then making it your own, because you're juxtaposing your work with published work to see how you're comparing. And that goes along with publication, because you should be reading the work in the places that you're submitting to before you submit to it. So not only should you be reading Flash if you're going to write it for ideas and for techniques and for craft, but also you should be looking at the kind of Flash that the publication that you're submitting to publishes to see if you fit in. If you have a fantastic zombie Flash, chances are a little low that someplace like, say, Smoke Long Quarterly will accept it. For sure, Brevity won't, because despite how much it feels real, Brevity is a nonfiction source. And if you're writing about real zombies, you could have metaphorical ones though. But if you're writing about real zombies, they aren't going to make it into Brevity because it's a nonfiction magazine. So I recommend doing a lot of reading, especially much of what I offered in that document that Carol provided you is available online. So it's really easy to do. And you can not only improve your sense of what Flash is, give yourself more confidence that you're writing within the genre in both unique ways and ways that will fit enough to be published, but then you'll grow to understand the magazines you want to publish too, and have a better chance of being published when you try to sit there. And that, my friends, is a bunch of ideas that I have about Flash fiction, and I would love to talk to you about your ideas. And if you want, we could either read some of what you came up with or do one more writing prompt or just talk. What do you want to do? Les?
Yes,
I would be interested to hear what some people have written. It'll make me feel better about my writing, or worse. I'm not sure.
What I asked you to do was really hard, but if anybody's willing to share, that's my favorite part of doing these things.
You're a hard act to follow, though.
Well, I didn't write anything.
I'm always happy to read, but I'm really clear from, I think, Leela's question that mine is prose poetry, not. So my challenge going forward, and I'll probably do this later today, is to go back through what I wrote and like, how can I make it more with the narrative arc and action and stuff like that, so.
Well, good news. We hadn't talked really about what Flash was on purpose. So I'm more than happy to hear your prose poetry too. And I think in the chat, Sarah said she's willing. Anybody want to read? I see Les going like this.
Well, that's hesitation.
No, let's
It's
go.
my way
Let's
of,
hear what you
it's a
have.
pronoun. You know?
Come on, read what you got.
So, you know, you asked us to do this before you even indicated what flash fiction was, so dirty pool. But I looked at it, since it was my first attempt to do anything like this, as an opening paragraph to another story, and there's no arc here, of course, it's, you know, a first, and so what I wrote was, not counting the misspellings, I used to be able to sleep away the night. Now I can set my watch by the times I must pee. I used to drink espresso and not blink an eye once. They would shut down for the night. I used to tie my shoes by bending to my toes. Now I hesitate for fear of crumbling like a potato chip, or worse, getting stuck and having to call the friendly fire department to soak me pliable again. So it was an opening sentence to the fear of a person having to go into an old age home or something, I don't know.
But there's a wonderful technique happening there that I forgot to mention, which is there's a great opportunity for repetition that is not, it doesn't rub on us the wrong way. We want to hear the next thing that you used to be able to do. And we understand that theme of, you know, betraying bodies, right? I've got one. Does anybody else have one? That's a great start. And you're not really that far from, I mean, because of reader implication, that narrative arc, we already understood by silence and absence what you used to be able to do and what you're fearing that you're not going to be able to do just by the list you gave us. That was a great start. Which reminded me, Les, thank you for reminding me with repetition. There are a lot of forms that are wonderful for flash fiction. And one of the ones that's my very favorite that I wanted to be sure I mentioned here is called hermit crab. And it's, you know, hermit crabs will take on anything to be a shell for themselves that works. And so for flash fiction, it's really fun to do something like write in the form of a recipe or write in the form of a wanted ad that in the world of newspapers back when we had wanted ads, right? Or write in the form of TikTok, hard to write in the form, no, of a tweet, right in the form of a tweet, right? And so anything you see around you, you know, right in the form of the ingredients list for these powdered drinks or whatever, is a way to create hermit crab flash fiction. And the other, or nonfiction, I think you're probably familiar with braided, but sometimes people will do something like, for example, a form of braided, but you can do this with anything, would be taking a historical fact and a personal fact, and then another historical fact and a personal fact, and just braid a flash in, you know, like say 6 paragraphs, right? So thank you, Les, for reminding me of that. There's also fragmented that I mentioned. You could have a lyric flash. You could have a numbered list, which is fantastic. Almost any form that you've seen in another form of writing can be modified to become flash free. Thanks. Sarah, did you say that you wanted to read?
Sure. I think I'm going to call it Without Hesitation. I used to be able to climb without hesitation up the yellow oak outside my bedroom dormer window. I barely tested the strength of the poking branches as I straddled one after another. The wind naturally swaying the leaves covered with delicate veins of life, billowing the blanket of the old oak offered. Today, a red-crested friend with a small black mask perches confidently on one of those supportive branches. Does the cardinal know he represents a gift sent from another spiritual place to my own? My first encounter with him is the day I find out I may soon transition to that special place. Perhaps he's come to show me the way. Perhaps one day I'll send a cardinal of my own. I'll bid him without hesitation.
Oh, wow.
That was beautiful.
Oh, you really gut punched us, I think 2 sentences before the end when you said that perhaps he showed up on this day when I've just found out that I may transition soon myself. right? And to go from the childhood person that could just leap out of the tree to the person that's questioning if she's the next to transition, it just breaks my heart. That's a really beautiful start. I hope you'll keep working on that.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? Lots of smiles. I think you broke a lot of hearts. Yeah, well done. Does anybody else want to read what you got?
I'd like to hear what
Oh,
Lysol, yeah.
yeah, and it's
Hear what LaSalle got?
myself, yeah.
Lysol.
I used to be able to laugh in face of surprises, delight bubbling to greet the novelty. A new home, a new outfit, a new job, a new friend. It was what I knew of life, nothing permanent. Everything arriving on my doorstep on time, even though I had no way to know this then. Laughter got replaced by responsibilities, all those have-tos that come with owning and attaching and sending roots into the earth. If I unpack every box here, my ability to leave is slowed, inhibited. If I open my heart here, my ability to stay true to myself is veiled in the habits of taking care of you. If I truly settle here, it feels like death to the wanderer, the runner, the escape artist. My wings held the lightness of laughter. My roots held the darkness of earth and sprouting potential. I'm not laughing now. My wings are wounded and folded in for healing.
Wow.
Well done.
Wow. Does anybody argue that that is not a narrative arc? Look at Tracy. She's like, no, that's a complete story. That was lovely, LaSalle. And I saw an absolute arc to that. And the first thing you did was slice us wide open. Your gut punch was the first line. I used to be able to laugh, and we're like, oh, what's coming? And it was both a celebration and then a study in what it meant to be who you were now. But there was a definite arc that arrived us there. It's just that I think in true amazing Flash form, you started at the climax, right? I used to be able to laugh, and here you take us down to where you are now, and it hurts. It was lovely. And you had some sensory detail in there in a really neat way. And the one question that popped into my head when you said I have these dark roots and these laughing wings, I wanted to know still what was between. And those wings are attached to something, the roots grow out of something. So that might be a thought just to carry with your revision as you work on this. It's nicely done. Isn't it amazing what we can do in 5 minutes? Does anybody else want to share?
I will share.
Great, Phyllis.
I used to be able to move fast, lift heavy things, remember names, and feel pretty. All of that gets harder over time, but I have added other things, other blessings. I can see my handsome grandson singing solos. I can enjoy free time to do as I please and read all day if I choose. I can say no to requests or obligations or expectations. In life, we give a little and we gain a little. That's it.
Oh, that was so lovely and so grateful and unexpected. You gave us that shift early and then just kept pushing us along that shift. Because when you began, we're all like, oh, right. I mean, I'm only 53 and I still remember the same things, right? And I have to say, you're still beautiful. But that ending, the things you basically said, those things don't matter as much anymore because of where I've arrived, what I earned through losing them, right? It was beautiful. Oh,
Like the writing gave us a gift. You gave us a gift by that.
yeah, I agree. I agree.
Thank you.
Tracy's people have woken up. Well, Carol, I don't want to go over time or anything, and I imagine you have some things to say, but I really quick would like to say, oh my goodness, what a delightful writing morning out for me, that you have been so amazing to be around and work with. And I thank you so much for being open to the ideas we have going here.
I want to thank you again, Max, for your time and your wisdom, your knowledge. It's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed this, given us a great insight into what flash fiction could be. And I guess like you, with reading Brenda Miller, I'm like, I may never try this genre again.
Max, I thought you were fantastic. I took notes after notes after notes, and I purposely kept myself muted because everybody here has heard me talk a million times and teach. And so I just purposely kept my mouth shut the whole time. And it was so hard because I wanted to jump in there with you on the Brenda Miller piece and just go, did you see how she did this? Did you see that? Did you notice how she did that? Yeah, she is masterful when it comes to this. Absolutely. Just study her. She's masterful. But anyway, you did a great job. Thank you so much.
Yes. And I hope that it has given you all some inspiration and some ideas for your own writing, and maybe for submission to our contest. We're all looking forward to seeing what you can do. In September, the winners will read their winning entries, and of course they'll be published on our website. And then we'll talk about the entries on why they won and why they didn't and whatnot. So with keeping anonymity, of course, we're not going to use the opportunity to trash, of course, because that's not useful. So I say that in part. Next, we have a slush pile that we do a couple of times a year. So that's all anonymous submissions. And I'm envisioning our discussion about the flash fiction in the way that we do that, which is always fun and helpful and I hope encouraging. So does anybody else have anything else that they want to add or to say?
My rescue pup here, he's got quite a few things he'd like to say.
He adores you.
I do need to go. I'm so sorry. Oh gosh, you can hear them. Maxie, thanks you so much. I really do appreciate it.
Tracy, thank you for inviting her, because she wouldn't be here without you. So thank you so very much. Yeah.
She can come back anytime. There are a million topics she can teach on.
Yes, well, welcome. We'll welcome you.
I had so much fun.
Okay, good.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Tracy.
Oh.
And Carol, this recording, for the people who time zones are hard, this recording is going to be available where for them? Or
I'm trying to figure out how to turn it off.
oh, just hit stop record. It's at the bottom, I think.